So there I was, Commander Jake Harrison. Though everyone back home called me Mudslinger for reasons that'll become painfully obvious, standing in what I can only describe as the galaxy's most pretentious waiting room. The walls were made of some kind of crystalline material that hummed with energy, and floating chairs that looked like they'd been designed by someone who'd never actually sat down before. Real comfortable. My transport had been shot down 3 days ago over this delightful little planet called Kepler 442b, which apparently translates to place where everything wants to eat you in the local dialect. I'd been trying to signal for rescue when I got picked up by what I thought were friendly locals. Turns out they were talent scouts for the most twisted game show in the known galaxy. Enter Vex Tribunus, our charming host, who looked like someone had crossed a praying mantis with a Las Vegas showman and given the result delusions of grandeur. He stood nearly 8 feet tall, draped in robes that shifted colors like oil on water, and spoke in the kind of voice that suggested he really enjoyed the sound of his own voice. Welcome, primitive creature, to the most prestigious survival competition in 7-star systems, Vex announced, gesturing dramatically with 4 arms. The Predator Avoidance Championship. Only the most evolved and technologically advanced species dare compete. I looked around at my fellow contestants and had to admit, they certainly looked the part. Each one was decked out in gear that probably cost more than my entire military pension. Sleek suits that shimmered with barely contained energy, helmets with more blinking lights than a Christmas tree, and weapons that hummed with the kind of power that made my standard-issue plasma rifle look like a water pistol. The rules are elegantly simple, Vex continued, clearly loving every second of this. Survive 3 rounds against our planet's most efficient predators. Use any means necessary. The winner earns their freedom and passage to any world of their choosing. He paused for dramatic effect, which seemed to be his favorite kind of effect. The loser becomes a permanent resident of our beautiful world. Well, technically they become plant fertilizer, but we prefer to think of it as contributing to the local ecosystem. Great. Just great. I'd gone from Marine Commander to unwilling game show contestant in the span of 48 hours. The other competitors were already discussing their strategies, comparing technical specifications of their cloaking devices and stealth systems like they were at some kind of deadly tech convention. And me? I had my wits, my training, and the kind of stubborn human refusal to die that had gotten me through worse situations than this. Probably worse situations than this. Actually, now that I thought about it, this was definitely in the top 5 worst situations I'd ever been in. But here's the thing about humans, that these fancy aliens were about to learn the hard way. We didn't become the dominant species on Earth by having the best technology. We did it by being too stupid to know when we were outmatched, and too stubborn to care when we figured it out. My fellow contestants were eager to share their strategies. Probably because they figured I'd be dead in the first 5 minutes anyway. Might as well humor the primitive human before he becomes Kepler 442b compost, right? First up was Zara, a Nexarian, who looked like she'd stepped out of a military recruitment poster. 7 feet of sleek purple skin, 4 eyes that never seemed to blink and sync, and an attitude that suggested she'd never met a problem she couldn't solve with superior technology. Her stealth suit was apparently top of the line, woven from something called quantum fibers that bent light around her body. My people have been perfecting optical camouflage for 3,000 years, she explained, running a hand along her suit with obvious pride. This beauty can render me invisible to every known spectrum of electromagnetic radiation, thermal, infrared, ultraviolet, you name it. These local predators won't even know I exist. Next was Grox, a Krillian, who looked like someone had decided a rhinoceros needed more armor plating and cybernetic implants. He was built like a tank, and apparently had the personality to match. His cloaking device was more of a portable fortress, a multi-phase energy field that could shift between different types of concealment, depending on the threat. Nexarian toys, he rumbled dismissively. My people engineer solutions that actually work. Phase shift technology, electromagnetic dampening, even pheromone scrubbers. When I activate this system, I don't just disappear. I cease to exist on every level these creatures can perceive. The third contestant was Pip, a flutterbee who honestly looked like someone had given a butterfly anxiety disorders and opposable thumbs. She kept wringing her 4 hands nervously while explaining her emotion-masking technology. Fear attracts predators, she chittered in a voice like wind chimes in a hurricane. My people have developed psychic dampeners that completely suppress emotional emanations. No fear, no excitement, no presence at all in the mental spectrum. I'll be emotionally invisible. They all turned to me expectantly, clearly waiting for me to explain my own high-tech solution to not getting eaten. I could see the barely concealed amusement in their expressions. The primitive human and his primitive methods. Cool story, I said, nodding appreciatively. Really impressive stuff. Me, I'm gonna roll around in mud and pretend to be a rock. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear Vex Tribunus's robes rustling from across the room. Excuse me, Zara asked, clearly convinced she'd misheard. Mud, I repeated helpfully. You know, dirt mixed with water, messy brown stuff. I'm gonna cover myself in it. Maybe throw in some local plant matter for authenticity, and then move around like I belong here. Predators don't usually waste energy hunting things that aren't worth eating. Grox made a sound that might have been laughter if Krillians were capable of joy. This is your strategy, Mud. Hey, don't knock it till you've tried it. I shrugged. Worked pretty well for my ancestors when they were avoiding things with bigger teeth than them. Pip's antenna twitched nervously. But that's so primitive. Primitively effective, I corrected. But hey, you stick with your fancy gadgets. I'm sure they'll work out great for you. The look they exchanged clearly said they were already planning how to split up my gear after I became the first casualty. Vex Tribunus led us to what he dramatically called the Arena of First Trials, which was basically a massive biodome filled with the kind of jungle that made the Amazon look like a petting zoo. The trees stretched up so high I couldn't see the ceiling, their trunks thick as starship hulls and covered in thorns that glowed with a distinctly unfriendly light. The air was thick enough to cut with a knife, humid and heavy with the scent of things that had been decomposing for way too long. Behold, Vex announced, his forearms sweeping dramatically, the hunting grounds of the razor hawks. Magnificent predators that have evolved beyond the need for physical eyes. They see heat, they see movement, they see the electromagnetic signatures of living beings. They are quite simply, perfect killing machines. As if on cue, something shrieked overhead. I caught a glimpse of wings that looked like they'd been forged from obsidian and bad intentions, with a wingspan that had to be at least 20 feet. The sound it made was like someone torturing a jet engine. You have 30 minutes to cross the arena, Vex continued. Reach the exit platform on the far side, and you advance to round 2. Get caught by a razor hawk, and well, we'll send your remains to your next of kin, if we can find enough pieces to identify. The other contestants were already powering up their equipment. Zara's suit began to shimmer as the quantum fibers activated, rendering her nearly invisible except for a slight distortion in the air. Grox's multi-phase system kicked in with a low hum, and he started to fade from view like a bad special effect. Pip's emotional dampeners engaged with a soft chiming sound, and her nervous twitching immediately stopped. Me? I started stripping. What are you doing? Pip squeaked, momentarily forgetting her emotional suppression. Getting ready, I said, pulling off my shirt and boots. Can't exactly roll around in mud while wearing a full military uniform. That'd just be silly. I'd been observing the local wildlife while we waited, and I'd noticed something interesting. There were these creatures that looked like a cross between a sheep and a beach ball, covered in thick matted fur that was always caked with mud. They moved in this distinctive shuffling gait, stopping every few steps to pretend to graze on the glowing moss that covered everything. The locals called them bumblocks, and apparently they tasted terrible and had the intelligence of wet cardboard. Perfect. I found a nice patch of mud mixed with decomposing plant matter, and proceeded to have what was probably the most dignified moment of my military career. Rolling around in alien swamp muck, while 3 advanced civilizations watched in horror. This is your plan? Zara asked, her voice coming from somewhere to my left, though I couldn't see her anymore. Part of it, I grunted, making sure to get the mud deep into my hair. See, your fancy suits are great and all, but they're thinking like engineers. Hide the heat signature, block the electromagnetic readings, become invisible. Very logical. I grabbed a handful of the local moss and rubbed it into the mud coating my skin. It smelled like feet and regret, but it was the same stuff the bumblocks rolled in. Problem is, you're still thinking like predators, I continued, getting to my feet and immediately adopting the bumblocks shuffle. Stop, shuffle, shuffle, stop. Look around nervously. Shuffle, shuffle, stop. The arena gates opened with a grinding sound like the planet's digestive system. I'm not trying to hide from the razor hawks, I explained, moving into the jungle with my new waddle. I'm trying to convince them I'm not worth hunting. What followed was probably the most educational 30 minutes of those aliens' lives. Zara moved through the jungle like a ghost, her advanced stealth suit rendering her nearly undetectable. Right up until she stepped on a branch wrong and a razor hawk locked onto the sound. Apparently, quantum fibers don't muffle footsteps. Her screams were cut short pretty quickly. Grox lasted longer, his multi-phase system cycling through different concealment modes as he methodically worked his way across the arena. Unfortunately, his engineering mindset made him predictable. He moved in straight lines, took the most efficient paths, and when his system briefly glitched in the humid air, he was caught in the open. The razor hawk that got him seemed almost bored by how easy it was. Pip made it about halfway before her emotional dampeners malfunctioned. Turns out, being emotionally invisible only works if your equipment doesn't short out from the moisture. The moment her terror spiked back online, every razor hawk in the arena knew exactly where she was. And me? I shuffled my way across that jungle like the world's most relaxed bumblocks. Stop, look around, shuffle forward a few steps, stop again. When razor hawks swooped overhead, I didn't run or freeze. I just kept doing what bumblocks do, which is basically nothing interesting. About 10 minutes in, one of them actually landed near me. This thing was gorgeous in the way that apex predators always are, all sleek death and perfect engineering. It tilted its head, studying me with senses I couldn't even comprehend. I shuffled closer to a patch of moss and made what I hoped were convincing bumblocks grazing sounds. The razor hawk watched for another few seconds, then took off with what I swear was a bird-like shrug. Not worth the effort. When I finally shuffled onto the exit platform, covered head to toe in mud and smelling like a swamp, Vex Tribunus was staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. His robes had stopped shifting colors and had settled on a sort of confused beige. "Congratulations," he said, though he sounded like the word tasted bad. "You have advanced to round 2. I grinned and wiped some mud out of my eyes. "Thanks. Got a towel?" Apparently towels weren't part of the package, because 20 minutes later I was still caked in dried mud and standing at the entrance to what Vex called the Labyrinth of Whispered Death, which honestly sounded like the kind of name you'd give a place if you were trying way too hard to be intimidating. The entrance was a hole in the ground about the size of a subway tunnel, except subway tunnels don't usually exhale the scent of things that died badly and recently. The walls were carved from some kind of black stone that seemed to absorb light, and I could hear things moving down there. Big things. With way too many legs. "Only 2 contestants remain," Vex announced, and I could swear there was a note of personal offense in his voice. Like I'd somehow cheated by not getting eaten yet. The challenges will now escalate accordingly. Zara had apparently been replaced by another Nexarian, this one introduced as Kex, same purple skin, same 4 eyes, same insufferable confidence, but with an even fancier stealth suit. This one was supposed to be military grade, complete with sound dampeners and scent scrubbers. "The tunnel serpents," Vex continued, gesturing toward the hole with obvious relish, "are the apex predators of Kepler 442b's underground ecosystem. They hunt by vibration, by scent, by the subtle changes in air pressure that living beings create simply by existing. They are patient, intelligent, and absolutely ruthless." A sound drifted up from the tunnels, like someone dragging wet leather across broken glass. Both Kex and I looked down into that darkness, and I'm pretty sure I wasn't the only one reconsidering my life choices. "The maze extends for 3 miles in every direction," Vex said. "Find the center chamber, retrieve the beacon, and return to this entrance. Simple. Oh, and try not to disturb the serpents. They get cranky when they're hunting." Kex was already adjusting her equipment, her suit systems humming to life. "Military-grade sound dampening," she said, probably more to herself than to me. "Electromagnetic scrubbers, pheromone filters, even gravitational field compensation. These tunnel worms won't even know I exist." I was studying the entrance, trying to get a read on the air currents. There was definitely something moving down there, something big enough to displace a lot of air. But there was also something else, a scent that reminded me of, "Hey Vex," I called out. "What do these tunnel serpents usually eat?" He looked annoyed by the question. "The native wildlife, obviously. Cave mice, primarily. Small, quick creatures that live in the upper tunnels." Cave mice. Perfect. While Kex was doing final systems checks on her fancy gear, I was listening to the sounds coming from the tunnels. The tunnel serpents moved with a distinctive rhythm. Long periods of absolute stillness, then sudden bursts of activity. Classic ambush predator behavior. But there was something else. A pattern to the sounds that wasn't quite random. The serpents were responding to something, following some kind of stimulus I couldn't quite identify yet. "Ready?" Kex asked, her voice now completely muffled by her suit's sound dampeners. "Just about," I said, heading over to a section of wall where I'd noticed something interesting. There was a dark stain on the stone, and when I got close enough, the smell hit me like a freight train. Tunnel serpent musk. Fresh enough to be potent, old enough to be safe. I started smearing it on my skin, over the dried mud that was still caked pretty much everywhere. "What are you doing now?" Kex asked, her voice crackling through her suit's communication system. "Perfume," I said, making sure to get the musk on my hands and arms. "You know, making myself attractive to the ladies. Or in this case, making myself smell like something the ladies have already marked as theirs." The smell was absolutely horrific. like someone had mixed rotten fish with industrial solvent and let it ferment in a gym sock. But it was also exactly what I needed. We descended into the tunnels together, though together was relative, since I could barely see Kex even when she was right next to me. Her stealth suit was working perfectly, rendering her nearly invisible and completely silent. The tunnels were a maze in the truest sense, branching and twisting in ways that seemed to defy basic geometry. The walls were smooth as glass, worn down by centuries of serpent passage, and the air was thick enough to taste. Every few minutes, we'd hear that wet leather sound echoing from somewhere in the darkness. Kex moved like a ghost, her military training evident in every step. She checked corners, tested the air, moved with the kind of precision that only came from years of combat experience. Her equipment was working flawlessly, masking every possible signature that might give her away, which made it all the more impressive when the first tunnel serpent found her anyway. I was following about 20 feet behind, moving in the stop-start pattern I'd observed from listening to the cave mice skittering around in the upper tunnels, when I heard Kex's comm system crackle to life. "Contact," she whispered. "Big one, maybe 30 feet long. It's looking right at me." The problem with perfect stealth technology is that it makes you overconfident. Kex had been moving through the tunnels like she owned them, taking the most direct routes, navigating with military efficiency. But tunnel serpents didn't hunt by sight or sound or even scent alone. They hunted by reading the environment, sensing the subtle changes that living things make in the world around them. And Kex, for all her advanced technology, was still thinking like a predator. "It's moving," she reported, her voice tight with controlled panic. "I don't understand. My readings show complete concealment across all spectrums." I could hear the serpent now, that wet leather sound getting closer. But I could also hear something else. The rapid panicked breathing that Kex's suit couldn't quite suppress. The slight tremor in her movements as fear started to override training. "Stay calm," I whispered into the darkness, though I wasn't sure if she could hear me. "Don't run. Running triggers their attack response." But it was too late. I heard her boots scrape against stone as she broke into a sprint, and immediately the tunnel filled with the sound of something massive moving very, very fast. The fight was over in seconds. Kex's scream cut off abruptly, replaced by sounds I really didn't want to think about too hard. Meanwhile, I kept doing my cave mouse impression. "Stop, listen, skitter forward a few steps, stop again." When I heard serpents moving nearby, I froze completely, then made the high-pitched distress calls I'd been practicing while we walked. Cave mice, it turned out, were incredibly paranoid creatures. They moved in short, erratic bursts, stopping constantly to listen for danger. And when they were scared, they made these pitiful squeaking sounds that basically announced to every predator in the area that they were small, helpless, and probably not worth the energy expenditure. About an hour into the maze, I had my first real encounter with a tunnel serpent. The thing was exactly as advertised. 30 feet of pure muscle covered in scales that looked like they'd been carved from obsidian. Its head was the size of a small car, with sensory organs I couldn't even identify, arranged around a mouthful of teeth that belonged in nightmares. It sensed me approaching from about 50 feet away, rising up from where it had been coiled in an alcove. For a long moment, we stared at each other in the dim bioluminescent glow that provided the only light in the tunnels. I froze completely, then made the most pathetic helpless cave mouse sound I could manage. A little squeak that basically said, "Please don't eat me. I'm tiny and scared and probably taste terrible." The serpent's head tilted, studying me with senses I couldn't comprehend. Then it did something I hadn't expected. It made a sound back, a low rumbling noise that I realized was the tunnel serpent equivalent of a dismissive snort, not worth the effort. It settled back into its alcove, and I skittered past like the world's most relieved cave mouse. The beacon was exactly where Vex had said it would be, sitting in the center chamber like a glowing middle finger. Getting back to the entrance was just more of the same. "Stop, listen," Skitter squeaked pathetically when something big showed up. When I finally emerged from the tunnels, still covered in mud, and now reeking of tunnel serpent musk, Vex was waiting with an expression that could have curdled milk. "Congratulations," he said, through gritted teeth. "One final challenge remains." The apex chamber was exactly what you'd expect from something with a name that dramatic. A massive spherical room carved from the same light-absorbing black stone as the tunnels. But this one was big enough to hold a football stadium. The walls curved up and away into darkness, and the only light came from bioluminescent patches that pulsed with an irregular rhythm, like a dying heartbeat. "Behold," Vex announced, his voice echoing strangely in the vast space, "the ultimate predator of Kepler 442b, the Void Stalker." At first I didn't see anything. The chamber appeared empty except for scattered bones that looked like they'd been picked clean by something with very thorough table manners. Then I caught a glimpse of movement in the shadows above, something that was less a creature and more like a living piece of the darkness itself. The Void Stalker, Vex continued with obvious relish, hunts by every method known to science. Sound, movement, heat, electromagnetic signature, chemical traces, even quantum fluctuations in local space-time. It is, quite literally, the perfect hunter. Nothing that lives can hide from it. The thing in the shadows shifted, and I got a better look at what I was dealing with. Imagine if someone had taken a spider, scaled it up to the size of a small building, then decided it needed more teeth, and a really bad attitude. 8 legs thick as tree trunks, each ending in claws that looked like they'd been forged from crystallized hate. Its body was covered in what looked like fur, except the fur moved independently, and seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But the worst part was its head. Multiple eyes that glowed with their own internal light, arranged around a mouth that was less a mouth and more like a portal to somewhere terrible. And the intelligence behind those eyes was unmistakable. This wasn't just a predator, this was a thinking, planning, calculating killing machine. Survive for 1 hour, Vex said, and you win your freedom. Get caught and well, I don't think there will be enough left to send home. The Void Stalker dropped from the ceiling with a sound like thunder, landing about 50 feet away with an impact that I felt through the soles of my feet. Up close it was even more impressive. And by impressive, I mean absolutely terrifying. It tilted its massive head, studying me with those glowing eyes, and I could practically feel it cataloging every detail. My heat signature, my heartbeat, the electromagnetic field generated by my nervous system, probably even my genetic code. This was it, the moment of truth. All my fancy predator-prey psychology was about to be put to the ultimate test. I started by regulating my breathing, slowing my heart rate using techniques I'd learned in Special Forces training. Not to hide from the creature, but to broadcast the right kind of fear. Prey animals don't panic when they're caught. They shut down. Then I moved to phase 2 of my plan, which was absolutely insane but theoretically sound. I started gathering fruit. The chamber floor was littered with the remnants of previous meals, and among the bones were scattered pieces of fruit from trees that grew in the upper levels. Most of it was too rotten to identify, but there were a few pieces that were perfect for my purposes. Overripe, fermented, and absolutely reeking of alcohol. The Void Stalker watched with obvious curiosity as I collected the fruit, crushing it between my hands and rubbing the fermented juice all over my skin. The smell was incredible, like someone had mixed wine with garbage and let it age in a hot car. But fermented fruit does something wonderful. It masks human pheromones, creates a cloud of chemical confusion that makes it hard for predators to get a clean read on their prey's emotional state. To the Void Stalker's senses, I was starting to become chemically invisible. Next came the really hard part, moving like prey. I'd studied prey animals my entire military career, because understanding how they think is crucial to understanding how predators hunt. Prey animals don't move like humans. They don't stride confidently or scan their environment systematically. They move in short, nervous bursts, freezing constantly to listen for danger. So I started to shuffle. Not the confident bumblocks waddle from the first challenge, but the erratic, panicked movement of something that knows it's being hunted. Stop. Look around frantically. Move a few steps, freeze again. My breathing became shallow and rapid, my movements jerky and unpredictable. The Void Stalker followed, staying about 30 feet back, its massive form moving with impossible silence. I could feel its attention like a physical weight, those glowing eyes analyzing every step I took. But here's the thing about apex predators. They're energy-efficient hunters. They don't waste effort on prey that isn't worth the calories they'll burn catching it. And right now, I was broadcasting every signal I could think of that said sickly, panicked, probably diseased, definitely not worth eating. About 20 minutes in, the Void Stalker made its move. It rushed forward with shocking speed, covering the distance between us in less than a second. But instead of running, instead of fighting, I did something that went against every human instinct I had. I collapsed. Not a dramatic fall, not a heroic last stand. I just dropped to the ground like a puppet with its strings cut, curled up in a ball, and started making the most pathetic whimpering sounds I could manage. The kind of sounds that small dying animals make when they're too weak to run anymore. The Void Stalker skidded to a halt inches from where I lay, its massive claws scraping against the stone floor. I could feel its breath on my skin, hot and smelling of things I didn't want to identify. Those glowing eyes were so close I could see my reflection in them. For a long moment, nothing happened. I lay there perfectly still, broadcasting weakness and sickness and absolute complete defeat. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure the creature could hear it, but I kept my breathing shallow and irregular, like something that was barely clinging to life. The Void Stalker made a sound I'd never heard before, a sort of rumbling growl mixed with what almost sounded like disgust. It circled me slowly, those massive claws clicking against the stone, but it didn't attack. Because here's what I'd figured out about apex predators during my years in the military. They don't just hunt for food, they hunt for sport, for the challenge, for the satisfaction of taking down something that fights back. A prey animal that just gives up, that offers no resistance, no chase, no struggle, isn't satisfying. It's just disappointing. The Void Stalker nudged me with one massive claw, hard enough to roll me over but not hard enough to cause damage. I remained completely limp, making only the faintest whimper of distress. In the predator's calculations, I had shifted from challenging prey to already dying carrion. And apex predators, as a rule, don't eat carrion. It's beneath them. After what felt like hours but was probably only a few minutes, the Void Stalker lost interest completely. It made that disgusted rumbling sound again, and retreated to the far side of the chamber, where it settled down to wait for more interesting prey to arrive. I spent the remaining 35 minutes of the challenge lying on that cold stone floor, perfectly motionless, while the galaxy's most perfect predator ignored me completely. It was simultaneously the most terrifying and most boring hour of my life. When Vex's voice finally echoed through the chamber announcing that time was up, I allowed myself a small smile. The Void Stalker didn't even look up when I stood and walked toward the exit. As far as it was concerned, I was already dead and just hadn't figured it out yet. Back in the crystalline waiting room, Vex Tribunus looked like someone had personally insulted his entire family tree. His robes had shifted to a color I can only describe as furious purple, and all four of his arms were clenched into fists. The floating chairs had stopped hovering and were now sitting on the floor like regular furniture, probably because even the room's technology was too depressed to function properly. "Congratulations," he said, and the word sounded like it was physically painful for him to utter. "You have won." I was still covered in mud, still reeking of tunnel serpent musk and fermented fruit, and I'm pretty sure I had some alien moss growing in my hair. But I was alive, and more importantly, I was free. "Thanks," I said, settling into one of the grounded chairs. "So about that passage to any world of my choosing. I'm thinking somewhere with good beaches, and absolutely no deadly wildlife. Maybe a nice resort planet where the most dangerous thing I have to worry about is sunburn." Vex gestured stiffly toward a transport pad that had materialized near the room's entrance. "Your ship awaits. But first I must ask, how did you do it? Your methods were primitive, crude, yet somehow effective against creatures that have defeated the most advanced civilizations in the galaxy." I leaned back in the chair, which was surprisingly comfortable now that it wasn't trying to float. "See, that's where you guys went wrong from the start. You were all thinking like engineers, like military strategists, like hunters. Advance this, high-tech that, superior evolution, blah blah blah." I gestured toward the now empty arena view screens, where highlights of the competition were still playing on loop. "But here's the thing about evolution. It's not about being the strongest or the fastest, or having the best technology. It's about survival. And humans? We've been the galaxy's premier survival specialists for about 200,000 years. Vex's four eyes narrowed. "Explain." "Gladly." I stood up, partly because I was enjoying this moment, and partly because sitting was making the mud crack in uncomfortable places. "Your contestants were all trying to hide from the predators. Logical approach, right? Can't get eaten if they can't find you. Problem is, you were still thinking like predators yourselves. Top of the food chain mentality." I started pacing, leaving muddy footprints on Vex's pristine floor. "But humans? We didn't start at the top of the food chain. We started at the bottom. We were prey animals for most of our evolutionary history. Everything on our planet wanted to eat us. Big cats, bears, wolves, crocodiles, venomous snakes, probably some of the plants too." Vex was listening intently now, his robes shifting to a more curious shade of blue-green. "So we developed something your advanced civilizations never had to learn," I continued. "We got really good at convincing predators that we weren't worth eating. Not by hiding, not by fighting, but by understanding how predators think." I pointed toward the arena screens. "Those razor hawks? They're energy-efficient hunters. They don't waste calories on prey that won't provide enough nutrition to justify the effort. So I convinced them I was a bumblocks. Herbivore. Tastes terrible. Barely worth the energy to catch. The tunnel serpents hunt by reading environmental changes, but they also have a sophisticated understanding of their ecosystem. They know cave mice are paranoid, skittish, and generally not worth bothering with unless they're really hungry. So I became the most pathetic cave mouse in the galaxy. Vex made a sound that might have been grudging admiration. And the Void Stalker? Ah. That was the masterpiece. I grinned. See, apex predators don't just hunt for food, they hunt for satisfaction. The thrill of the chase, the challenge of taking down dangerous prey. What they don't do is waste time on something that's already dying. I spread my arms wide, still grinning. So I became the most disappointing prey animal in the history of disappointing prey animals. Sick, weak, chemically confused, and absolutely zero challenge to hunt. The Void Stalker took one look at me, and basically said not worth it, and went to take a nap. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of various recording devices throughout the room frantically documenting everything I'd said. Apparently, my little survival seminar was being broadcast to the entire galaxy. You see, I continued, your problem wasn't that you didn't have good enough technology. Your problem was that you were thinking like predators trying to hide from other predators. But I was thinking like prey trying to survive predators. Completely different mindset. Vex's robes had shifted to a pattern I'd never seen before. Swirling colors that seemed to indicate he was processing some kind of philosophical crisis. Millions of years of evolution, I said, heading toward the transport pad. Trump fancy gadgets every single time. My ancestors survived ice ages, volcanic eruptions, plague, famine, and every kind of predator you can imagine. Not because they were the strongest or the smartest, but because they were too stubborn to die, and too clever to fight fair. I paused at the edge of the transport pad, and looked back at Vex, who was still staring at me with that expression of someone whose worldview had just been completely rearranged. Here's the thing about humans that nobody ever expects, I said. We're not apex predators, we're apex survivors. There's a difference. Predators dominate through strength and technology. Survivors adapt through cunning and persistence. Guess which one's more useful when the chips are down. The transport pad began to glow beneath my feet, and I could feel the familiar tingle of matter displacement beginning. Oh, and Vex? I called out as the teleportation sequence initiated. You might want to update your recruitment criteria. Looking for advanced civilizations with superior technology is great, and all, but sometimes the most dangerous opponent is the one who's already figured out how to lose and survive it. The last thing I saw before the transport whisked me away was Vex frantically taking notes while a dozen different alien species crowded around the viewing screens, apparently having heated discussions about primitive human survival techniques. My transport ship was exactly what I'd asked for. Small, comfortable, and equipped with navigation systems that could get me to the nearest resort planet without any detours through hostile territory. As we cleared Kepler 442b's atmosphere, I finally allowed myself to relax. I'd gone from Marine Commander to unwilling game show contestant to intergalactic survival expert in the span of 3 days. Not bad for a primitive human with a mud fetish. And somewhere out there in the galaxy, I was pretty sure a whole lot of advanced civilizations were about to start taking a much closer look at the species that had learned how to turn cowardice into an art form. The universe was about to get a lot more interesting.